Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, civilians in Mali are targeted by Russian mercenaries in the overwhelming majority of their engagements. A new report accuses Wagner fighters of also attacking non-military targets in Central African Republic. Also, the fallout of the Africa-Japan summit continues between Morocco and Tunisia. A political spat deepens after being sparked over the weekend by Tunis's hosting of the head of the self-proclaimed independent region of Western Sahara, which Morocco claims as its own. And Egypt has a centuries-long tradition of winemaking. Contemporary production is still on a small scale, but wineries are barreling ahead with plans to add polish and popularity to their products. But first, UN peacekeepers in Mali accuse the army and unspecified foreign military personnel of killing at least 50 civilians and arresting hundreds of others in April. MINUSMA says that dozens were allegedly killed as Malian troops carried out a sweep in Hombori after a convoy was attacked by a roadside bomb. Since taking power in 2020, Mali's ruling junta has relied increasingly on Russian operatives it describes as military trainers. Separately, a report released by a crisis monitoring organisation suggests that Russian mercenaries in Mali target civilians in well over half of their operations. The Wagner Group has ties to the Kremlin and operates in other African countries, including Central African Republic, Mozambique and Libya. Sam Bradpiece has more.
Fighters from the Wagner Group have been operating in Mali since late 2021. Since then, according to this new data, these Russian mercenaries have targeted civilians in 71% of their operations in the country. To put that in context, even Nusrat al-Islam, the official branch of al-Qaeda operating in Mali, targets civilians with a lower frequency. It's estimated that some 500 civilians have been killed in joint operations involving the Wagner Group since December. One of the worst incidents took place in the central town of Moura, where hundreds of unarmed men were executed and thrown into mass graves. The Malian junta flat out denies the fact that the Wagner Group is even operating on its territory, despite the Russian foreign minister admitting as such earlier this year. Worryingly, amid the withdrawal of the French forces and the stifling of MINUSMA, the Malian junta appears to be increasingly turning towards the Wagner Group to help with anti-Islamist operations in the country. So far, the evidence suggests that this strategy is hardly working.
Regional correspondent Sam Bradpiece there for us. Now, around 500,000 Nigerians have been affected by flooding caused by heavy rains this year. 23 out of 36 states have struggled with rising waters, with northeastern states having been particularly badly hit. At least 100 people are believed to have been killed in the inundation so far. Some of those affected in Maiduguri have lost farms and homes and say that they have never experienced such destructive flooding. A political spat between Morocco and Tunisia continues, having been sparked over the weekend by Tunis's hosting of the head of the Polisario Front, the leader of the self-proclaimed independent region of Western Sahara. Now, Morocco sees it as part of its territory. Kimi Nedlek tells us more.
Morocco's anger shows no signs of abating. The Moroccan Federation of Consumer Rights called for a boycott of Tunisian products.
The Moroccan Consumer Rights Federation condemns the hostile positions of the Tunisian head of state by receiving a separatist and a terrorist at the head of a fictitious state.
The diplomatic spat was sparked off over the weekend during the Africa-Japan summit in Tunis. Tunisian President Kais Saied went to the airport to personally receive Brahim Ghali, the leader of the Polisario Front and of the self-proclaimed autonomous territory of the Western Sahara. Rabat considers the Western Sahara Moroccan, and its autonomy is not recognised by the UN or most other countries, although the African Union accepted it as a member state. In recent days, the respective ambassadors of the two countries have been recalled. On Wednesday, Morocco announced that its volleyball team would not participate in the next competitions scheduled in Tunis.
وأعتقد أنه الآن هناك تشنج كبير.
There is a great tension now, and there is an attempt to use this crisis to worsen the diplomatic and political situation between two brotherly and friendly countries. It's important to calm it all down.
Morocco wants its allies to have a clear position on the status of Western Sahara. Last week, Germany declared its support for Moroccan-led autonomy in the territory, a plan rejected by Ghali, who demands a referendum.
Jailed South African Paralympic champion Oscar Pistorius has asked the courts to force prison authorities to consider him for parole. Pistorius was found guilty of murder and jailed for 13 years in 2014 for the fatal shooting of his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp. Convicts have to serve at least half of their term to be considered for parole in South Africa. Known as Blade Runner because of his prosthetics, in 2012 Pistorius became the first double amputee to race at the Olympics. Faced with the ravages of climate change, the fallout from the pandemic and shocks from the war in Ukraine, food systems everywhere are devastatingly fragile, but nowhere more so than across Africa. An estimated 322 million people on the continent experience severe food insecurity, and the crisis is getting worse. Earlier, I asked the US Special Envoy for Global Food Security whether the continent should have been better prepared for the shocks that came with the war in Ukraine.
It's hard to say that we shouldn't have been better prepared. I've been working in this field since the mid-'70s, and I think one of the things that I've noticed most about the current situation is that unlike previous famines and acute food insecure situations, this one is really caused by multiple causal factors. So in the past, you might have had a drought or some other situation like that plunged people into food insecurity or famine. Today, we have climate, we have COVID, we have conflict, we have all the other issues that I mentioned earlier. And what that means, I think, is that this is going to be a crisis that unfolds over several years. It can't easily be solved in 1 year. We're going to have to go through a couple of cropping seasons. And it also means that we have to really understand farming systems, particularly in Africa, and be prepared to address the totality of issues.
And you can catch the entirety of that interview in The Interview, which will be broadcast in France 24's output throughout Wednesday evening and Thursday. For 100 years, 3 generations of one family in Ghana painstakingly amassed the world's largest collection of 20th century Ghanaian photographs under one roof. In a studio opened in 1922 in the capital, the 50,000-strong image archive offers a unique glimpse into Accra's transition from a colonial port into a bustling modern metropolis. Take a look.
We have, I'm sure, more than 50,000 pictures, could even be more. We have a lot of glass plates as well. We have a lot of negatives as well. And honestly, the story they tell is about the history. Those days, the early days from when slaves were taken out. We have the forts. We have pictures of the forts. We have pictures of the politicians. We have pictures of traditions, all of that really. So there's so much to tell, even the buildings.
If we don't preserve them, it means the nation is going to lose its memory. And our children will come and they will not know anything. They will only be abreast with what is happening around them. But then, we live in the world, a dynamic world, and we must be conversant about the entire history, the entire spectrum of history, what happened in the past. If you know what happened in the past, then you appreciate the present, and then you'll be able to predict the future.
I love it. I'd love to get a look at that. Anyway, finally, Egypt's wine tradition has been drunk since the time of the pharaohs. Today, the country continues to produce its own grapes and has become one of the foremost wine-growing regions in the Middle East. Local producers are working hard to improve the quality of their output, as our correspondents report.
It's 10 o'clock in the morning and labourers are hard at work in this vineyard to the north of Cairo. Here they grow 10 or so different varieties of grape, for the most part those well adapted to the harsh conditions, like the excessive heat, and much more besides. This agricultural engineer has come to inspect this year's crop.
The problems that we find growing grapes in Egypt are the high levels of salt in the earth and in the water. We chose this part of Katatba because the salt levels in the earth aren't very high, and as for the water, it's between 200 and 500 parts per million. It's very well suited to growing grapes.
If the vines are found in the north of the country, you have to go to Guna, an upmarket resort on the Red Sea, to watch them be turned into wine. It's here that Labib Kalas has chosen to call home. He spent 2 decades painstakingly developing Egyptian wines.
I'll admit that there are limits here. We'll never be able to make a great Egyptian wine on the same level as the great European wines. We know there is lots holding us back in this country. Imported wines are subject to a 3,000% customs tariff. That's a very good thing for wine producers and people who live here, and tourists take advantage of that to buy Egyptian.
And in the trendy bars of Guna, there's a willing market. At this private party, it's Egyptian wine on the tables.
It's very affordable and it's not sweet. For me, it's important to have a well-balanced wine. I've tried the wine several times and I think it's getting much better in terms of taste.
Focused on a domestic market largely aimed at tourists, Egyptian wine is still little known outside the country. But producers still hope the sector will mature and attract more international pairings.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
They're known for their cuisine and saying hello with a kiss. They only work 35 hours per week, when they're not on strike, that is. How true are these clichés about France? Every week, Florence Villeminot tears apart stereotypes. Join us for insight into French culture and current events to understand what makes the French so unique.
French Connections, presented by Florence Villeminot on France 24 and France24.com.